And welcome to the Mailbox. This is a weekly bit that I do where I look at some of the comments people have left on various bits of social media for me, mostly from YouTube. I think most of these comments, if not all of them, are from YouTube this week as well, but it could equally be from Twitter or Patreon or wherever. And I go over them with a little bit of a more detailed answer than it potentially can get if I just respond to it with a bit of text. First things first, in terms of questions as well, I'm trying something new out as well. A bit of a shout out to Peculiar from Wowhead. I randomly saw tweet something earlier in the week about something called Curious Cat. This is a way where you set up a profile and people can just ask you random questions and you can get around to answering them. So that is on curiouscat.me/Thete Gaming. So if you wanted to ask any questions, you could try it there as well as the usual places. I am going to trial this out and see if it actually seems to work pretty well. So on to the questions, and this week we'll start off with, I feel that at the very least they should limit the trait combos such that they can't roll the 3 worst on the same relic. This is of course talking about the Netherlight Crucible. I've done a guide on the Netherlight Crucible which takes into account the clarifications that Blizzard came out with, and also a vlog shortly after it as well, so that should cover with everything you sort of need to know. But yeah, this idea of it, like on PTR for example, on 2 of my relics on the PTR, the traits that I get an option of, on one of the relics they're all awful, and on another one of the relics 2 of them are awful and one of them is so there's only one relic where you even get a decent one, and even that's not BIS. And you could say, well, stop whinging, you can't always have BIS, and this is true. But I think what a lot of people dislike is the fact that it's a very RNG system that has very meaningful effects. It's one of those things. RNG is like what loot drops off a boss on a given week and stuff like that. But over time, it smooths itself out. This is the sort of RNG that doesn't smooth itself out. That is the issue with it. Like, you know, at the start of a tier, you're in your raid group. Some people will naturally gear up a little bit quicker because the stuff that's good for them happens to drop. They're just looking. Some people are waiting forever for their BIS trinkets or tier or something like that. But after a few weeks, it all starts to level itself out a little bit. That's what's happened in every guild I've ever been in from day dot. But this, as I say, the sheer number of combinations and so on are so great that this is not the sort of thing that smooths itself out after a few weeks or even over the course of a tier. So you can have people stunningly lucky getting BIS or second BIS traits on every relic, and you can get some people who will never get them. And the difference in performance capable as a result of that is quite significant. But the issue with this one is, you know, do it in such a way that you can't possibly roll the 3 of the worst ones. The problem with it is Blizzard, not from what they've said recently, but from certain, they could have changed their mind. But from what they were saying during the Legion Alpha, they don't accept that anything that they put in the game is bad. You know, in terms of this. So, for example, they don't accept that any of the relic traits are poor. Just like they didn't accept that any of the talents were poor. And anything like that. So it becomes very difficult with that mindset, even if you change your mind as a developer, but don't want to look foolish, which is a bit silly. It's a bit foolish to look like that, actually. No one's going to blame them for just going, actually, do you know what, we got that wrong. They've done that a few times, this expansion, where they have gone, do you know what, we got that wrong. No one made a fuss about it. Everyone was actually just pleased. But, you know, that's just the way it is. So they won't do that just because, as I say, they don't accept that any of those traits are bad. They were not going to come out and say, yeah, we deliberately put bad traits on because we couldn't think of anything different. We couldn't think of anything else to do. Next comment was, this was the only non-Warcraft one. Obviously, I keep this as World of Warcraft, but I did do a video on Lord of the Rings Online, which took me rather by surprise because I did this when I was playing a bit of Elder Scrolls Online, particularly towards the start of the year. I sort of want to play a bit. I haven't really played any this summer, but I do want to. But there's so much else taking my time up. And, you know, and I did a couple of videos on Elder Scrolls Online. You know, people, you know, thought that was okay. And then when I started to get to Lord of the Rings Online, so I thought, well, I'll do another one. I'll just say what I think of it, reason why I'm playing it again. Especially as some of you who are going to be watching me streaming, every now and then will watch me streaming Lord of the Rings Online. So you might want to know, why am I playing this? So I did a video on that, and it was quite a long one in the end. And I thought, you know, it's not really going to be watched. It's been watched by a ridiculous number of people. And this is really surprising because, for my channel, a ridiculous number of people, that is. Because, first of all, you look at Lord of the Rings Online YouTubers and they get very few views. They have very low subscription numbers, even by my standards. And you just think there's no real market for it. And it sort of ties in with the idea that I have that there's not that many players. There's obviously enough players that it warrants keeping the game going, even to the point where the previous game developers didn't want any more to do with it, not because they think it's a bad game, but because they want to focus more into other games, and that the people who are working on it have formed their own company to take it on. So there's obviously enough players to keep it sustainable, but not that many, certainly not as a World of Warcraft player. So it surprised me just how many people viewed it and commented on it, even more so. So, but yeah, I got this comment, which is really weird, and I don't know how I gave this impression. Saying, amazing a relatively new game can look so old. And it's like, this game's 10 years old. How is that new in anyone's vernacular? I mean, computer games in general are only as old as I'm basically as old as computer games. And 10 years is a significant portion of my life. And it's yeah, you're not going to call a computer game new. And then the rest of the comment, I don't really. It says, no idea why I even waste my life watching a video about this trash game. Well, I can't answer that. Even more why I write this comment, can't answer that either. But all comments gratefully received. But yeah, I just thought that was a bit of an odd one. Amazing how a new game can look so old. It's not a new game. It's not at all. Right, next thing. It says, anyone know if Vial, which is a trinket that we can get in Tomb of Sargeras that applies a dot, snapshots with wings? Now, someone did answer this by saying that, you know, snapshotting was removed in after Mist rather, blah, 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 which is true. But it is a point worth mentioning here. You do sometimes see people reference... This is what's been so difficult about gearing choices in Legion, is trying to get people away from older systems of... You know, because people, I think now, we're just starting to stop seeing people asking for Bislis because they don't exist. They did exist at one time when, you know, gear was fairly static. Now they don't exist because of the massive variation in item level that you can get because of Titan Forging. Nothing to do even with the different modes of raiding, because that's been around for a few expansions now, or a couple of expansions, I should say. But yeah, it's... So there's no such thing as a Bislis, but there's also, you sometimes see this being talked about, snapshotting, because what's probably happening is people obviously wanting to learn more about the game, reading up on it, which is good, and then they read about this thing, snapshotting, which did exist in the game, but doesn't anymore. So snapshotting is the idea that when you apply a dot, or indeed a hot to something, but a dot in this case, the amount of damage each tick does is based on the power of your character at the time you cast it, whereas that doesn't happen anymore. Now it's at the point at which each tick happens. Because, yes, as the person has indicated there was a time when certain things were just becoming far too powerful. In fact, even I remember using Execution Sentence when it was a thing in MOP. What I used to do is I would, you know, pop all my cooldowns and I would wait because my strength would stack up and I'd wait for it to get to its peak. And I knew what that peak was. And then I would fire off my Execution Sentence, so you'd wait because it snapshotted, whereas now it wouldn't. Next comment. Every time I see gameplay from your Paladin, I can't get my eyes off your hammer. Ooh. I really dislike that hammer. Oh, it's so small. I think you'll find that my hammer is above average size. I really don't know what to say to this one. It's quite a large hammer. I'm not sure what hammers you're used to, but this one's a fairly beefy hammer, I think. I've got much smaller hammers, and I've seen much smaller hammers. But anyway, thank you. Well, an easy explanation of why Blizz might favour EU players over NA players sometimes is because there are much more WoW players in EU, the better guilds are in EU, etc., etc. Again, I mean, people have used this one before. Doesn't make a lick of sense, and I will explain why in one easy step. And this was quite topical this week as well. If there was favoritism for the EU, for whatever reason, it really doesn't matter what the reason is, but you've gone with more players. I don't know whether there are more players in the EU. It is possible. There are certainly more people who live in countries that would use the EU forums than would use the North American forums, as far as I can tell. The way I sort of work that out is basically look at the population of Europe. You've also got to bear in mind people in Russia would use the European servers as well. Also people in the Middle East and parts of Africa too. Whereas North America tends to be like, well, I suppose everyone in America, all of America, United States, Canada, Mexico, all the way down to South America, and potentially Australasia as well. But I think predominantly North America and Australia and New Zealand would probably be the people using those. Now, the reason why it doesn't make any sense is because of the EU forums. Now, this, like I say, has been quite topical, but it's been talked about for many years. And that is, occasionally you see developers commenting on posts on forums. More usually on like PTR or Alpha Beta forums, but they occasionally respond on just general topics as well. And this has been going on for some years, but it's always on North American forums. They have never once responded to something just out of the blue on a European forum. Now that gives you the impression that they obviously they haven't got time to read the forums all day. That's what community managers are for. But when they do read forums, they're obviously just reading the North American ones, which might make a certain amount of sense. They're based in North America, but they obviously never read the European ones. Otherwise, you would expect every now and then for them to post something there. But when they do post something there, it's never a response to a discussion going on. It's always just a post that was going to be made, as in, I've got something to say, here it is. And often it's a copy from something they've done in the North American ones anyway, which we didn't even used to get that. I mean, that was a bit of a nonsense of it. It's only in Legion under Ian Hazakostas that we've even had posts from Blues appear there, starting a conversation off. We didn't even, as I say, used to get that. So the idea that there's favoritism for the EU completely doesn't make sense when you consider that they have no involvement in the EU community whatsoever, as in zero. Beyond attending conventions that happen to be held in the EU, such as Gamescom coming up. Next comment about dying to ridiculously easy old bosses. So this is me talking about my incredulity at people that could actually die to the Fel Reaver, not because it was weak, but just because it was so noisy and stomped the ground. I don't understand how anyone could be caught unawares by this behemoth. But anyway, the comment goes on to say, regardless of whether it was Fel Reaver or some oddly challenging critter, one of my most favourite feelings in this game is just going back to something that used to scare the pudding out of me and just one-shotting it. Which is really strange. I have heard people say things like that before, and I have heard people say it as a reason not, for example, to bring scaling into the game. But I always have the opposite one. Like, for me, the big bogeyman in my, like, WoW career, so to speak, was in Duskwood, in the original from the game Vanilla, on my Paladin. And it was Morladim, who in life was Morgan Ladymore, but as an undead elite, Morladim. And you'd be around sort of the northwestish of Duskwood, and there'd be loads of undead about. And as a Paladin, you could track undead. The problem is they were all just dots. The elite one didn't have a special dot, it's just a normal dot. You would sometimes look on the map for it. But every now and then, be attacking elites, and every now and then he'd mug you. He'd just come up behind you and smack you in the mouth. And you'd try and do your stun and run away. And as a Paladin, you could usually run away. But every now and then he killed me. And it was always with fear that I quested in that area, because you'd always be on the lookout for him. And I do remember going back much later on, not to kill him, but for some other reason. Like, and I came across him and just one-shot him. And I actually thought it was quite sad. I thought, this was something that used to actually make me nervous. It's one of the reasons why Duskwood used to be my favourite zone. Because you had this thing that might be lurking around any corner. And you had to go there because there were quests to do there. And the tension was nothing like I'd felt since I stopped playing Doom. And yet, so when I went back, it was actually quite sad that it had diminished effectively. So yeah, I have a different view on that one. But there's plenty of people who do have the view of going back and getting revenge. There's a comment here. I seem to have chopped a bit off. I don't know why. It says the difference between EU and US is the top EU guilds beta test new content. Oh, no, I haven't. US guilds don't. Blizzard absolutely needs the EU raiding scene, but the US raiding scene has no value to them, blah, blah, blah. Again, I don't buy this. There is something weird, by the way. There is some strange reason, and I don't know what it is, why... And I know people are scratching for answers, but... There is a reason why the majority of the highest progressed PvE guilds are in Europe rather than North America. I don't know why that is. People come up with all sorts of outlandish theories, which is very baffling. I mean, the most prevalent is that here in the EU, our governments pay us to sit at home in our pants playing computer games all day. They don't at all. They don't like us doing that at all. So you have to be able to fund yourself. Another theory is, it's all just people being funded by their parents to stay at home. Well, it's like, well, Americans have parents too, and Canadians come to that. I'm pretty sure Australians do as well. So I'm not sure that, there's nothing culturally about Europe where parents are keener for their offspring to be whiling away their, 20s playing computer games under their protection. I don't. So again, that doesn't make any sense to me in here. And this thing here about them beta tested. US guilds absolutely beta test. Any guild that did not beta test would not be rushing towards the fast progress that they all make. Okay? I know a lot of these guilds, even when they're in the top 10, it's significantly behind the likes of Method. But they wouldn't even get that far were they not beta tested. Also, it doesn't really... I don't know what the basis for this would be on. Because if you look at the forums, obviously what Blizzard do is they put feedback forums for raid testing bosses, which, as I say, they've only just started doing on the EU in Legion. When you look at them, you don't see pages and pages and pages of feedback from the EU and like a couple of posts on the US, do you? No. You see plenty of feedback from both. I mean, it is a fact that there are not as many, and I don't know whether it's in the US, maybe more people are keener on the PvP aspects of games than PvE. Maybe there's a cultural thing there. I don't know what it is. But it is certainly not the case that in the EU, serious guilds are going, right, we must raid test all this stuff. Apart from anything else, it's not done at convenient times in the EU. I'm not saying it's always necessarily hugely convenient in the US either, but they're certainly not put on at convenient times in Europe. And then, but the counter thing being in America, they go, no, we're not going to beta test. We're just going to go there when it goes live and see what happens. It's nonsense. So, yeah, no, that's not the reason. Next question. I don't hear anyone talking about the item level problem. Mop eye level cap was 600, 608 legendary. WOD was 730, blah, blah, blah. And now Legion is going above 1,000. Right, it's not really, but... it's hitting it, or click. Well, it's about there. They really need to completely retune the system because the numbers are getting out of hand. Now, here's the thing. I thought this myself a couple of expansions ago, and as I did a little bit of maths on it to have a look. And what you found is here. I've done a graph here. Now, what this graph is of, I'll just show you. There's bars and there's a line graph. The bars indicate the difference between the item level that drops off the easiest boss in that expansion. So if like in vanilla it'd be Lucifer, the first boss in Molten Core. Oh dear. And the highest one is the highest item level that drops off the very last boss of the expansion. I had to fudge it a little bit for the vanilla one because they took Naxxramas out of the game. I do still have a Nax item, but not one that drops off Kel'Thuzad. So I just used the item level of the item I still have. So it might not be 100% accurate, that one. But the other ones are. Now, I haven't taken Titanforge into account for Legion. Or Legendaries. But just in terms of the base items that drop between the lowest item level raid gear you can get and the highest item level raid gear you can get. And what you see is, on the bars, you can see it escalated pretty quickly in the first few expansions. This is not a recent thing. In fact, Wrath, it hit a bit of a peak. Then it dropped quite a lot for Kata. Maybe a little bit of a surprise. But possibly due to the fact that Cataclysm had 3 tiers of raiding, whereas Wrath had 4. I sort of put it down to that. Then it went up a bit for Mop, up a bit for WOD. and up a bit for Legion. But if you look at it, it's sort of fairly linear. And given that Legion has gone back to the 4 tiers as well, it's probably sort of keeping in step. But then the line is what I sort of look at. And of course, there's different ways you can measure this, and different people have different views on which way you should measure it. But I sort of did it as a quotient as well. So what I did is I divided the difference by the base item level of the lowest item level thing in the game to get what is the percentage inflation in item level over the course of the raid tiers of an expansion. And what you find is it was actually really high in the first few expansions of the game and has dropped. So what you can see here, in vanilla it was fairly high. You know, that quotient was round about 30 odd %. Then in TBC it reached a peak of over 40%. Then it dropped down a little bit for Wrath, and then it plummeted for Cataclysm to around about the 15% mark. And there it has remained. So in actual fact, the inflation in percentage terms, and it has to be in percentage terms, has been fairly static. So although you can argue it's getting out of hand just because of the size of the numbers, it's not, the inflation has not actually been any greater in the last few expansions. And one thing, you know, because this is the reason why I was a bit concerned by it, I was thinking, well, it's caused by the fact we have all these different modes of raids now. You know, you've now got 4 modes of raids, LFR, normal, heroic, and mythic. Well, this can't help. But in actual fact, it was way higher when, you know, vanilla and TBC, when there was only 1 mode of each raid. So, yeah, I think you look at it like this, you can, yeah, the numbers are getting really big, but percentage-wise, the inflation has actually come down in the last few expansions. Next question. I actually hate this Netherlight Crucible. It's stupid that it's random. You can get an upgrade, then find out later it's not. I think this is the crux of it as well. Like when you talk about RNG, I mean, there's RNG then loot that drops, so you might get a neck and you can look at that neck and it's 20 item levels upgrade. Oh, that'd be good. And then you look at it and you've worked out your stat weights and you look at it or you sim it and it goes, no, it's not actually an upgrade. Pass for someone else. The next level of RNG can be tier gear. So let's say everyone in the raid has tier. A tier token drops. So what we, I imagine everyone does this. What we do in our raid is we give it to someone to see if they can roll Warforged or Titanforged or get a socket on it. So it's a bit of an upgrade on what they've got. Most of the time, of course, it's not. Just gets vended or sharded. But sometimes it will be. So you give it for that. But it's RNG. You can't actually tell. Until someone uses the token, you can't actually tell whether it's an upgrade or not. So the Loot Council, we have to sort of try and guess who it's most likely to benefit. So obviously someone who's got the baseline version but with a socket, we probably wouldn't give it to, we'd probably just give it to someone who's just got the baseline version with nothing extra on it. You know, and just hope for the best. The relics is a different level altogether. You could literally have a situation with the relic system with the Netherlight Crucible where it's a 5 item level upgrade for someone with the same trait. So in the here and now, it's a definite upgrade for them. It's a definite upgrade. But then they take it to the Netherlight Crucible and they found out because the 2nd and 3rd tier abilities on it are not as good, that 5 item level upgrade could end up being a downgrade. And then they don't equip it. So then there's someone else who was in the raid for whom it was also an upgrade, thinking, well, you know, I could have had that and I might have got some good traits put into the Crucible. But of course, the fact that putting it into the Crucible to have a look, even before you slot it into your weapon, we now know binds it to you. They confirmed that in the last few days, it binds it to you. So you can't just trade it to someone else either. Yeah, I think this is an absolutely awful system. And this comes on to the next comment. Legion, the good expansion with awful systems. And this is very much the way I think about it. I think Legion is a very good expansion. I think they've delivered on what they said they would. We've been so used for the last few expansions to Blizzard overhyping stuff. I don't think they've done that in Legion. I think they've actually done what they said they would do. They may not have done it in this way we would all like them to have done, but they have delivered on what they said they would do, which has not always been the case in the last few years. Often what they've said they were going to do in expansion they've ended up abandoning, not lying, but they've ended up abandoning things because they couldn't do it or couldn't do it well enough for whatever reason. Not really happened here. but it does have some terrible systems in it. It has caused the death of a lot of raiders, not literally, figuratively. The sheer amount of stuff that raiders feel compelled to do, how much of it they actually have to do is another matter, but feel compelled to do because of systems in the game has caused a massive recruitment crisis within raiding. I know that as someone who struggles on a daily basis to recruit people for my guild. It's not as bad as it was in Nighthold, but it's still very bad. It's still worse than it's ever been in any previous expansion. And I have recruited in a lot of expansions. And yeah, so the systems are very bad. The legendary system is very bad. The artifact power system, although it does what Blizzard wants it to do, is very bad in its, not in principle, but in its inception. And this Netherlight crucible is just, I don't even know what they're thinking anymore. Last one. This is a really interesting one, actually. I've saved the best to last. It says, if they could just code the abilities a bit differently, instead of being able to get soaked, let the payback effect from not soaking trigger if the ability deals no damage. That way people can immune their portion of the damage but not negate the encounter mechanics. So this is talking about soak mechanics and too much power in the hands of people who can basically immune them. It's an interesting idea. I mean, one potential outlet of this could be that if you don't soak something, that instead of like wiping or killing people or wiping the raid, you get a penalty. I remember it might work a bit like the original Archimond in Hydril, where if someone died, the whole raid got a debuff. Depending on the role of the person that died, that debuff might be a silence. Everyone might get silenced for a bit. Pretty bad news for your tanks. They're not going to get any healing for a bit. It might be a damaging dot or something like that. That might be interesting. It could be interesting if what it did was to reduce everyone's damage. Then your DPS whores wouldn't like that very much. They'd soon start soaking at that point. The only downside to it that I can see is that because it would encourage good behaviour, it would make the fights arguably easier. I think one of the cleverest things Blizzard have done with encounter design in the past few years is to deliberately design, and increasingly in my opinion, design fights such that players who are focusing on their own damage and trying to increase it are actually wiping their raid. There's so many fights where this happens. It used to be the odd fight where you would sort of say to your raid group, look, this is a mechanics fight, we need to do the mechanics. Now it's most of them. People that DPS whore are almost always wiping their raid now, because the only way to DPS whore is to ignore mechanics that, and you know, it might have been the case at one time that maybe 2 or 3 people could deal with mechanics. Now increasingly you need everyone in the raid to be able to do them. And soaking mechanics are an easy way to do that. So it's very noticeable in Tomb of Sargeras. So yeah, that I would see as the disadvantage. I think it would be very interesting for that sort of thing to happen. I don't think it will happen because, as I say, I think Blizzard long ago abandoned thoughts of any genuine innovation. I know we've got some new systems in Legion, but if you actually look closely at the new things we've got in Legion, they've all been in other games. They've already been in other MMOs. So you could basically just say they've done what Blizzard do pretty well, which is to take ideas from other areas and just make them better. So you can see that in all of the new things in World of Warcraft, in Legion. So in terms of genuine innovation, there hasn't really been anything for a while, so I don't think they would do this. And as I say, you know, it would have that drawback because I think it's quite good that the guilds that get on the fastest at a certain level are the ones who are most disciplined, who actually get it through their own raiders, thickheads, that actually, if everyone realises that the mechanics are for them, not for other people, then you will kill the boss faster. And the fact that you have people who don't do that and are therefore, you know, wiping their guild unnecessarily, I think that's a good thing. Even though I suffer from it myself, I think that's a good thing. But anyway, so those are the questions for this week. Keep them coming. I'll say, don't forget Curious Me, if you want to have a look at that one, curiouscat.me, I should say. Again, I'll trial it this week and I'll see how it goes. And then I'll sort of decide from there, or over the next few weeks, I should say, really, from there whether it's worth me sort of plugging it a bit more. If it gets too many, then I can't keep up with it. Then obviously that's a failed trial. If it gets none at all, then of course that's a failed trial as well. Somewhere nice and in the middle is pretty good. So thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.